Hello, welcome to the latest video revision lesson. This time I'll be focusing on how to tackle a question on the Power and Conflict AQA section in the exam, and the two poems I'll be focusing on are Remains and War Photographer. A reminder on the screen at the moment as to where you can head to find a lot more videos on a range of topics for your GCSE English, Literature and Language. Right, okay, so a reminder that the two poems are Remains and War Photographer, so it might be useful to brush up on your knowledge on these two poems. If you're a member of my site, you can check out the two videos on each of the poems, War Photographer and Remains, before coming back to this one. Right, so the assessment objectives are AO1, AO2 and AO3, similar to most of the other questions on the AQA literature paper. The 30 marks are broken down 12, 12 and 6. You've got about 45 minutes to answer this question, so 5 or 6 minutes to plan, 35 minutes to do your writing, and a few minutes at the end to read over your work. Okay, and I'll break down how to structure your answer, obviously, throughout the course of this video. So, there's more than one way to skin a cat, or perhaps a little less graphic, there's more than one way to cook an egg. What I mean by this is simply there's more than one acceptable way to structure your answer to this question. What follows is just one way. You may prefer the way your own teacher has suggested. That's absolutely fine. So long as you're ticking all the boxes the examiner's looking for you to tick, which I will cover through the course of the video, that's the main thing. So what does a question in the exam look like? Well, here's one, and it's the one that we'll be looking at in this video. Compare how poets present the effects of conflict in Remains and in one other poem from Power and Conflict. Remember, I've already said I'm going to choose War Photographer, but I'll explain how I came about that decision later. So compare how poets present the effects of conflict in Remains and in one other poem from Power and Conflict. So keywords compare. You must compare in every paragraph. Now, I say that you could talk about one poem and then talk about the second poem and then compare at the end of that paragraph. You must not forget to do the comparison because that's the key instruction in the question. I find it more logical, adds greater fluency, and it's kind of ensures that you are comparing sufficiently if you compare in each paragraph. For example, don't just analyse that I've said don't just on one poem and then the other. Compare the structure of each poem within the same paragraph and then move on to your next point. Okay. Again, if your teachers have told you something slightly different, run with that. If you don't like the sound of this. The effects of conflict and Remains, the first thing you need to do is to read the question highlighting the key words. In this case, effects of conflict. That's the central point of this question. So everything you write about, everything you comment in each of your paragraphs must have some bearing on the effects of conflict. You need to identify the second poem. In this case, I'm going to use War Photographer. I'll explain how I arrived at that in a moment. Now you can read through the poem and highlight, underline everything you notice that relates to the question. Okay, and here's one I made earlier. You don't need to read what I've written. Actually, apologies for the quality of my handwriting. I didn't write this with the intention that it would ever be read. I did this as just an exercise myself to illustrate to you, the process involved. So here I've highlighted and annotated some areas of the poem I think I can use in my answer. I've highlighted compare. I've highlighted effects of conflict. Don't ignore the title in this poem and also on the unseen section. Don't ignore the title because that's important. And so the title Remains here is quite ambiguous. Is it what's left behind emotionally, or memory, or the actual physical body of the looter that's left behind? And you can see I've gone through there. I've taken 3 or 4 minutes. I've highlighted and I've jotted down some notes. And I'm going to bang on about method and meaning quite a few times. Identifying poetic devices is important, but you must also explore the significance of these methods. What were the poet's intentions? How successful were they? What impact does it have? Method and meaning, that's to secure the top band 7, 8, 9 grades in your exam. Okay, so based on my annotations on the previous screen, I've jotted down these notes and I've put method and meaning on the screen just to remind you. So irregular line length and absence of a rhyme scheme, both reflecting a lack of control over thoughts perhaps. So there's my method, irregular line length, absence of a rhyme scheme. The meaning that could reflect a lack of control over thoughts. Remains is ambiguous. What's left is no good. Memory of horror of attack. If you look at the dictionary definition of remains, you'll find that it generally means it's not such a positive thing. It shifts to first person from we to I, reflecting acceptance of responsibility. There's your method and your meaning. Graphic imagery, inside out, rips, onomatopoeic, tosses his guts, revealing the shock, horror of war, juxtaposed with the kind of colloquial language that the speaker uses, making it sound like an everyday event, but it's absolutely horrific. Enjolment from stanzas 5 to 6 to reflect the continuing horror. Drink and drugs, the impact of experience of post-traumatic stress disorder. Stunned and smothered, sibilant and violent adjectives enhances the impact. Repetition of bloody in the last line reflects the guilt and lasting impact and acknowledgement of that. He said, my bloody guilt, my bloody hands, he says, sorry. So that kind of possessive pronoun. So there's some notes I've jotted down. You don't need to do it in a separate thing. You can do it on the actual, alongside the paper as I did on the previous screen. Next, how do I select the second poem? Good question. Well, the best advice, straight from the examiners, and I am one now, is to base your answer on an idea or attitude, and then take a two-pronged approach to the question. So, you should be looking to link two poems based on their meaning, rather than both, say, being in sonnet form. For example, both Remains and War Photographer deal with the effects of war on the individual once they've returned home. So the photographer, as he's developing his photographs back in his darkroom, and the soldier as he's returned from the Falklands War. However, one is dealing with the effects on a soldier once he's stopped fighting and returns home, whilst the other explores the effects of witnessing a war zone through a lens on a photographer as he develops his injuries, Freudian slip, his images. So some tips. You then need to focus on language, form, structure and effect, using relevant terminology where possible, and making links with context where appropriate. Now, this may occur naturally in the answering of the question. Don't have a separate paragraph for context. The examiner's not expecting that and not looking for that. Just in your natural discussion and analysis of the two poems, you will probably be ticking the context box anyway. But language, form and structure are important, and the effects, that's method and meaning. If it helps, you could follow the SMILE structure. Keep watching, it's coming up. Use the language of the question throughout, so effects of conflict. Always link back to the question in each paragraph and for each poem. A topic sentence at the start of each paragraph will ensure you remain focused on the actual question. Okay, so how to structure your answer using the SMILE format. Remember, you're analysing these poems in terms of how they link with conflict, power and conflict. Here are some generic tips. It is good advice to write a short introduction in every section on the literature paper, so including your anthology section. Introduce your second poem immediately and straight away set about comparing. For example, both Remains and War Photographer deal with the effects of war on the individual once they've returned home. However, one is dealing with the effects on a soldier once he has stopped fighting and returned home, whilst the other explores the effects of witnessing a war zone through a lens on a photographer as he develops his images. So there's my comparative connectives there. I've introduced a second poem and I've started comparing straight away. So the rest of the smile at the poem, it might be difficult, smile through gritted teeth perhaps. Structure and form, so is the poem in a particular style? Sonnet, dramatic monologue, can this be linked to context? Is there any rhyme scheme? Is there any reason you can think of for the specific words being rhymed? If there is no rhyme, why do you think that may be? Are there stanzas? Is there a regular line length? Is punctuation used to help add meaning? Are different types of sentences used to create effects? Do sentences run on, enjolment, or stop, end stopped? Is caesura, any punctuation located in the middle of a line, used? What does this tell us about the mentality of the persona, the narrator, the speaker, the poet? If you've got access to the PDF here, if your membership allows access to the PDF, do print this off, because this can be, pinned up on your notice board, on your wall, or wherever, and you can keep referring back to it for any practice question that you do. Meaning, mood. So what's the poem about? Are there any hidden messages? What is the attitude or tone of the poem or speaker? Serious, angry, sad, regretful, amused, bored, cynical, objective, passionate. Choose your own words. Can this link to context? What word, pictures or images are used in the extract? Imagery is about language choices, not just techniques. Are there any similes? Are there any metaphors? Is there any use of personification? Then language language and imagery kind of combined. What are the key words or phrases that stand out? Does it use imperatives or exaggeration, litos, understatements, hyperbole, exaggeration? Are there any other writing techniques which stand out, such as rhetorical questions, emotive language, alliteration, or repetition? Zoom in on specific word choices and explore their effect. Now, although E is separated here, it's not a separate paragraph. You need to incorporate effects, which is meaning, throughout every paragraph. And a brief summative sentence that links directly back to the question. Again, I'm not going to read through this. It's a list of poetic devices that you can use in your analysis, both for the anthology and for the unseen section. Do either screenshot this or pause, take some notes, print it out, whatever. Okay, so back to the question, because we've forgotten what that is now. Compare how poets present the effects of conflict in Remains and in one other poem from Power and Conflict. Remember, I've decided to use War Photographer. So here's my sample introduction. I've kind of alluded to it a bit earlier. Both Remains and War Photographer explore the effects of conflict on an individual once they've returned. Remains is based on the true story of a soldier suffering from PTSD, having returned from Iraq, whereas War Photographer focuses on the reflections of a photographer back in his darkroom in England waiting for his pictures to develop. So there's a sample introduction. So recalling the structure, here's a sample opening paragraph point you could write. In black, I've highlighted the elements within each paragraph the examiner's looking for. Remember that kind of point evidence technique, explanation, impact, etc. In Remains, there is no regular line length or rhyme scheme, which could make it sound like someone telling a story, or reflect the lack of control the narrator has over the post-traumatic stress he now suffers. Alternative interpretations are important for top band. You're kind of peeling back the layers. Don't take it at face value. Explore alternative or multiple interpretations. By contrast, War Photographer has a very tight structure throughout, comprising an A, B, B, C, D, D rhyme scheme within 4 stanzas of equal length. This could be seen as an attempt to impose a sense of order and control over something as chaotic as war. The fact that there is no change in how the poem is structured possibly reflects the futility of war, and possibly the futility of trying to express the horrors surrounding it. Remains starts with the first person plural we, to perhaps deflect blame to others, but soon shifts to I, making it far more personal, almost like a confession. There are 7 stanzas of 4 lines, followed by a separated couplet at the end, which lends a finality to the narrator's guilt and torment. Enjambment is effectively used throughout to highlight the ongoing suffering experienced, in particular between stanza 2 and 3, and again between stanza 5 and 6. Sosura also serves to heighten this tension. War Photographer, on the other hand, has more of a cyclical structure. It begins and ends with the photographer's journey to and from a war zone, reinforcing how nothing changes, how war continues. I think I've written more on the end of that, but anyway, that's a detailed opening point that you could make. So I've put down a couple of other points that you could make. You can then structure them in your own words, and if your membership allows, you can submit an exam answer to this question, and I will mark and return it with feedback in terms of how you can improve and get the higher grade. So meaning, mood, tone and context. So the title Remains offers various suggestions. Firstly, remains are what's left behind. So in this case it could be the looter's body or the blood shadow or even the soldier himself, who doesn't die but is left behind to deal with the emotional ramifications of what he's done. The dictionary definition of remains implies that what is left behind is no good, and this could describe the soldier as a civilian who cannot cope and resorts to drink and drugs, but the drink and the drugs won't flush him out. War Photographer, Carol Ann Duffy is friends with 2 renowned war photographers, and the title implies this poem will focus on their experience of war. This poem was published in 1985 at a time before digital cameras and smartphones. It's important because this is when photographs were developed in very different ways to how they are now. This is in what's called dark rooms. This is important to bear in mind as it lies at the centre of the poem, the development of the photographer's reflections as he waits for his images to develop. Language and imagery. In Remains, the use of colloquial language l'exit is used at the start to reflect the everyday nature of the event, but the man's death is described in gory detail through very graphic imagery, rips through his life, sort of inside out, image of agony, and tosses his guts, which hammer home the horrors of war for the reader. Whereas in War Photographer, Sosura is also used. Rural England to emphasise how the reader fails to grasp the true horrors of war and simply carries on with life. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and the pre-lunch beers. In opening stanza, the dark room and red light have sinister connotations which clash with the religious imagery of the church and mass. This juxtaposition reflects the impossible task of trying to make sense of war and its consequences. So you'll need a couple, 2 or 3 bits of evidence from your second poem to reinforce the points that you're making. Right, I think that's wrap. Oh dear, right, yeah, I do apologise. I'm cringing on everyone's behalf as you are on mine. Right, hopefully you found this useful. Do check out mrhonline.co.uk for plenty more videos on everything you'll need to fulfil your potential at your GCSE English Lang and Lit exams. Best of luck in them. Bye now.